for this meeting or for this talk. And I also need to start a screen share. There's the screen share. Okay, hi everyone. So my 3 hashtags are stage fright, Vue.js, and tired, because I had a really bad weekend. And there's a lot of stuff to do at work currently. So hopefully the talk, I didn't talk it through yet. So I hope it will be all natural. All mistakes will be made here for the first time. So please enjoy and please correct me if I say anything wrong. Yeah, short introduction, I already gave it. I'm Lucas, I'm here in Leipzig. I work at GitLab since 2018. I'm currently a front-end engineering manager for the ecosystem team. So GitLab has different teams, and my team works mainly on integrations, like, for example, integrating with other products like Slack or Jira or Mattermost from the Jira side. Previously, I worked on the secure team. So shout out to the guys from the secure team who are here. And the secure team basically wasn't about necessarily security in the sense of, hey, I'm the person, or we are the people who are looking for specific things. It was more part of the product that we were providing, hey, automatic security scanning, so like dependency updates or scanning your code for vulnerable things. Unfortunately, the scanners are not really good for Vue yet, so you might need to do the secure coding in Vue yourself. So with that introduction, I'm not a security researcher. I don't have a lot of experience. I didn't, in the time, try to XSS Amazon or eBay and got money from it. So I just know the stuff from work. So it could be that I make mistakes and I don't have like big historical background. Cross-site scripting and web application security is really, really a rabbit hole. And I just try to give some context from the things that I know and that I've experienced in the past. Yeah. Usually I would, talk about remote work here for a second, because GitLab is an all remote company. So we're distributed all around the globe and all working from home. And I make jokes about sitting in pajamas all day. Actually, our design system is called Pajamas. So design.gitlab.com is pajamas, yeah. But the problem is now most of you probably know remote work in one form or another, and you all know Zoom. So yeah, there's not much to talk about thanks to this little pandemic that we have. Anyhow, jumping into the topic. So I just want to give a really brief introduction. What is cross-site scripting? Mainly stole information from Wikipedia and just going to talk a bit. How is Vue affected? Where do we need to watch out? It's basically 3 things in my opinion. And then I will give a demo. The link to the demo is already here as a little project, so you can check it out. It's actually a Nuxt app. You can check it out and check it later yourself. Repeating some tips and tricks, because when it comes to cross-site scripting or vulnerabilities in the front end, it's usually repeating the same things over and over again and make sure people internalize it. Then in the end, we have rooms for questions, right? A room for questions. And I currently don't see the chat, so let me just open the chat. If there's something during the talk, if you have a question, you can throw it in here, or I don't know, I think you can still unmute yourself, if you want to dive into something, we can do that, or we can go back to it at the end of the talk. Yeah, because usually I'm used, if I'm giving a talk at the meetup, to involve the crowd, which is a bit harder doing with Zoom. So please feel free to interrupt me, right? Yeah, so diving in, cross-site scripting. So what is cross-site scripting? Cross-site scripting is the most common attack vector that we have in websites or web applications. I mean, more and more stuff moves to applications in the web now. And it's generally, what happens is that some attacker is able to inject foreign JavaScript into the context of the site or the application and circumventing security policies or that basically, for example, same origin policies from the browser. So you're able to load JavaScript that's, from some random web page or to execute something. And usually what happens is you are on a web page where you're logged in, and then basically the injected JavaScript would potentially send your cookie or some other information, mainly cookies probably, that have your authentication in it to a remote site. And then someone could use that remote site to log in, right? Or if you, for example, think of pages like for like web shops or something, they could inject an JavaScript that, monitors the credentials that you added, or not the credentials, like your credit card details, for example, if you're on a web shop, and sends your credit card information off to somewhere else, and then someone else would be using your credit card. There are a lot of layers to cross-site scripting. So often, there are certain techniques of obfuscating like these things. There are a lot of details, that are involved with how a browser works, how a browser parses an HTML document. Browsers are very complex creatures. So you don't only have HTML, you have SVG, you have other content there. You have CSS. You even can do cross-site scripting now by injecting CSS. You can do there's a lot that can possibly go wrong there, but mainly there are two things. There's so-called non-persistent attacks and persistent attacks, and it all comes down to the same idea. And in the end, it doesn't really matter how the cross-site scripting is executed, because you need to be able to understand, what is generally, how does cross-site scripting work in a root cause. And if someone is, injecting an SVG or injecting JavaScript or injecting CSS, doesn't really matter, because, you need to protect yourself against that injection in general. So let's dive into these two attack modes, the non-persistent attacks and the persistent attacks. So the non-persistent attacks is, I would say, similar to a phishing link. You could imagine that if you have like a search engine or a search field on your website, and you would do something not that smart, or you have like something that's encoded in query parameters, where either your backend renders something out as a directly, like if it's PHP or Ruby, just rendering what it got in the query string. You could potentially, inject some JavaScript or some other stuff if you don't look at the content of the query parameter. So, you could send someone a link, like a phishing link, for example, and then the person clicks on it, opens the web shop, and it sends off the details. So generally, how people demonstrate that cross-site scripting theoretically is possible. So cross-site scripting, you would generally include JavaScript from a foreign source, but how people generally show it, because if you can show that, you probably can do everything, is they use alert, in order to show that alert box, and then, hey, instead of the alert, I could have gone and fetched a remote resource, or different things, and then executed. Just by that alert, you're basically able to show that you're able to exploit that web page with that specific attack. Persistent attacks, they actually work like the same, but instead of a link, you would have something that someone is able to save something. Let's say, for example, if you have something like Craigslist, or I don't know, someone would be able to inject JavaScript there, and everyone who visits that page, I don't know, some mintage, some mint vintage wizard card or something. Wizard, I mean Magic the Gathering. Why do I think Wizard? Magic the Gathering card, right? For a cheap price, people go there, and then it would send off the login details of those people. But basically the same idea, you would be able to inject JavaScript. So how does that apply to Vue? So in Vue, we basically have three things that could, in my opinion, maybe I'm missing something, that could lead to a potential injection. The first one is vue-HTML. What vue-HTML actually does, that Directive takes HTML and puts it into the inner HTML of that node where you're adding the vue-HTML. So if the HTML that you has some is exploitable, someone is able to inject something into that HTML and you don't clean it up, you will be vulnerable to cross-site scripting. This is actually the reason why React has chosen a better name for it, in my opinion, right? So they call it dangerously set inner HTML. So because that makes it more clear that you're actually doing something that is dangerous. vue-HTML seems pretty harmless name-wise, so maybe it would be better if it actually would be named vue-HTML. Don't really use this. Please escape your stuff properly. HTML, inner HTML directive, something like that, right? The other one would be vbind href. This is the most likely one. You could also think probably there are other things that you shouldn't do. So there are certain events that elements could have. For example, an on-error event or an on-load event or an on-click event. You probably should never set something like an on-click event, or I don't know, an accept user input there. But vbind href, on anchor tags is the most likely one. You have someone that's providing like a link on a user profile. Let's say you have like some developer community and you link to your GitLab, GitHub profiles and you allow the person to set a link. So that, for example, would potentially be cross-site scriptable if you're not careful and just using the link that the user gave you. The third one is a bit more tricky. External libraries. So even if you're doing everything correctly in your code and have vue-HTML using correctly, clean up before you pass things to vue-HTML, or if you also are really sure that your links are all okay, there are external libraries, right? And that could be that you have, the reason could be that you have legacy code, or you're wrapping like a nice library like select2 or something else like jQuery or something outdated. You're wrapping that in Vue. And if that stuff is cross-site scriptable, if there are potential vulnerabilities there, you could also inherit those potential vulnerabilities. I will also show an example where we use that, but it could also be with Vue libraries, right? So imagine, for example, a Vue Markdown library, and you allow user input to be created, passed into that Vue Markdown library, and the Vue Markdown library doesn't, clean up the code, sets vue-HTML, and bam, you're vulnerable again. So jumping right into demo, because I think code and demo is how we learn stuff or can see it. I have prepared this little thing. You can find it on this GitLab page. It's a Git repo. Check it out. I maybe can, for the people who are on computer, let me just paste it into the chat. Makes it a bit easier. Yeah, but this is basically the page. So this is very bright. So let me just reload real quick. Yes. Okay. So I have different implementations of the right-hand side, and I have different data that I can pass in. So what we have here is just like, hey, you can pass in a username, you can pass in a link, you can pass in an avatar, and you can pass in a biography. In order to show that the biography is potentially, people want maybe in the biography to have it, formatted, but think it could be anything, right? It could be Markdown on some page. It could be a description for a product that you let person said, or whatever. So here you can already see that this is the base state. You say, hey, we have a link, target blank. We pipe in the profile URL and we pipe in the biography, and we can see the HTML works beautifully, and we can see that my profile opens. So just in order to show real quick that we're vulnerable to certain things with this default application. So if we, for example, have like a link, so this is JavaScript alert XCSS, allow a person to set that on the profile page. If I click it now, I get a new page that opens with XCSS. But if the target weren't blank, I think probably the context is still there. I'm not 100% sure, but you see the idea. I could do anything here now. I could fetch some external resource, and every time the person clicks that link, you end up with a problem. Similar with the vue-HTML. So let me load some unsafe HTML. You can see here, hey, it looks the same, but actually the biography is wrapped by something that has an on-mouse over event. So if I hover over it, I will get that exploit. Yeah, so let's start with the link. How can we protect ourselves against such a vulnerable link? So there are multiple ways to do that. So one, and big shout out to one of my colleagues. So we have a safe link directive, right? And so if I have an XSS scriptable link, actually nothing will happen. It just opens an empty tab, but it basically cleans up the link for ourselves. Actually, I wanted to show you the implementation of that component, of that directive, because it's actually, it's part of our component framework, but you actually, I'm saying actually a lot, but you could just copy that code for the safe link directive and use it. So you can see that you have a directive that basically checks whether the URL is secure. And if the URL is secure, so it's trying to parse the URL, and it allows, in this implementation, allows HTTP and HTTPS links and mail to and FTP links, and also relative links, and checks if the protocol is there. So if the protocol would be JavaScript, it wouldn't allow that link and just replaces it with an empty string. And it also adds some other properties to that link. But here you can see if the link is unsafe, and that is what happened. It just opens the about blank page. There might be a different implementation because you might want to show people information. This might be more useful in the in security circles, for example. Similar implementation. So the idea behind it is to say, here we just created one component. So it's not the rendered full profile example, but just imagine that you call this like save link, and instead of using an A, you could use that as a safe link. It doesn't, in order to keep the implementation simple, it doesn't, forward any, doesn't forward anything. Doesn't forward any other properties that you might want to put on the A tag. I mean, it actually will still put there if you use it, now that I think about it. And we don't really use the directive, so I should have removed it from the code. But what happens here? Very important console log. So what happens here is you provide a property. This time it's profile, but it also could be href, right? In order to have the same interface as a normal link. Then you have a computed property which checks whether the link is safe, and if the link is safe, it renders the link. Otherwise, it would just render like unsafe URL and print something out. And So you can see that depending on your use case, you might need to fine tune this. So if I'm, for example, thinking of an internal portal, right? You could say, hey, everything that's just in our domain. So for example, gitlab.com is a safe link. We just want to link people within the application to our application ourselves. So if I'm just having the normal, the normal data, it would render the link. And if I, and if I, for example, enter evil domain, and this is just like something that people do in security circles, they always replace the TT in HTTP or HTTPS with XX in order to show that it's a potentially evil domain, so that people still might not be able to be phished, right? Because it's not copyable and doesn't work in a browser, or you cannot link it that easy. If you copy it into a chat app, it won't autocomplete. So for example, if you have like a phishing attempt or something, that it's clear that this is an unsafe URL. You could also think about an implementation where you basically have 3 states. Hey, let's check if it's a safe URL. If it's a URL in our own platform, just link to our own platform. If it's an external link, maybe link to one of those pages that you might all have seen, like, hey, you're leaving our safe page. Please be careful. Don't enter your gitlab.com credentials or whatever on that page. You're basically leaving the safe harbor that is our application. And if it's those JavaScript links or whatever, just swallow the error. This is, in my opinion, how you should deal with dangerous links, or could deal with dangerous links. And you can see it's really easy to do. And one of the advantages that this would have in general, and if you're wrapping all your links with such a component, if you made a mistake in the implementation or want to change the implementation, you don't have to go and change all the links. You already have those links wrapped, right? And in a quick research, I haven't found a cool NPM library that is able to do like a good sanitization of URL links. So if somebody has one, just put it in. But for the next example, where we're looking at HTML, I using the DOM Purify library. So you can see that I still get my beautiful HTML rendering. So I don't know, maybe this shouldn't be strong. This should be an H1 because we don't have an H1 on this page. And you can see it's clean. And if I'm using my accessible HTML and hover over it, you see that nothing happens, while with the default implementation, we get our XSS. So the way we did it here, we basically used a computed property, and the computed property, just runs DOM purify sanitize. And on this, on the HTML that we pipe in from the outside, and then uses that. And as long as DOM purify is working correctly, it's really fast and good. We can be sure that it works. You also could imagine like, hey, the computed property, in the first step, it generates HTML from Markdown, or maybe gets the HTML from an external page, or however you want to have it, and sanitizes it. Or similarly, you could even be more restrictive with DOM Purify. It removes a lot of the evil things. But if you're thinking about, for example, creating something like a comment system, you might be even able to scope it down even more and say, hey, we just really want to allow you to write like headlines and strong text, to make the text bold, or emphasis or whatever, to make the text italics, so that if you have like a comment felt with a WYSIWYG editor, that you just allow the stuff that you pipe in. Or if you're like, hey, potentially people could include like images, so one of the images that have, let's see if I can write something like that, ad hoc. Images, that DOM Purify would be able to clean this. So source equals let's see. I mean, this should be fine, right? Let's see if the default implementation, is accessible, right? So if you imagine that you have like an editor where someone is able to add an image, you also need something like DOM Purify in order to clean up that image, like the on error events, for example. So these are the big two, right? Just in order to repeat ourselves, hey, vue-HTML, make sure that you clean it up. Probably the safest way is to use something like DOM Purify. However, this has a caveat. Recently, browsers had problems. So last year, browsers had problems with mixed content of HTML and I think mathml. So this is in order to render mathematical notations. So people were able, if they have a comment field where you allow mathematical stuff as well, or you could enter HTML or like Markdown, they could potentially exploit this. Even with DOM Purify. So you should also always make sure to update these libraries in order to protect yourself against vulnerabilities. And also the golden rule should be here, be as strict as possible. Yes, DOM Purify by default allows like a lot of stuff and it looks nice. But if I'm having a comment field or I'm just allowing people, to upload images, maybe just allow the image tag. If I have a comment field and just allow a strong tag and emphasis tag, why should you allow all the other stuff? DOM Purify has the capability so that you basically can provide a list of all the things that you want to reject, or the other way around, actually just the list of elements that you want to allow in the HTML. So the last example, just in order to show you, is a bit contrived. Imagine it could be another library, not just jQuery. It could be another library like jQuery, not just jQuery, but something like select2, or something else that you're using that might not be Vue native, but also interacts with the DOM. And potentially leads to problems. So this is an old version of jQuery. So this is version jQuery 3.40. And there has just been a vulnerability fix and a new version of jQuery came out, I think, last month or so, or maybe I think 2 months ago in April, that fixed this vulnerability. So and this is, just in order to show how brittle certain things can be. So basically, and we can look at the actual code in a second. So basically, what jQuery is doing, jQuery, already sanitizes HTML if you add it with HTML. Maybe I should go into the implementation of the Vue component first. Sorry. So it has a property called biography. It's the biography that we pipe in. It just watches that property in order to update the HTML. On mounted, we initialize it once, and the update basically just sets the HTML with jQuery. This is why I said it's a bit contrived, right? But you could imagine, as again, any other library. And basically, the vulnerability that jQuery had is that if you have like weird syntax here, right? It ends up expanding the HTML in a wrong way, and basically everything that happens after here, so would be outside of the normal HTML context of jQuery, so it doesn't clean it up. So if I'm going now and hover it, I get my XSS again. And just in order to show that jQuery is actually capable of cleaning this up normally, if we would use, for example, if we just remove this and hover here, oops. This is weird. I thought it's capable of removing that. So yeah, maybe it's not even capable of cleaning this normally. So maybe it's a bad example, but basically to show what I said is that, yeah, thank you, that the HTML under the hood, it basically ends up having these style tags within each other and moving this on mouse over tag outside of this scope and thus not cleaning it properly. In order to maybe show that thank you again, that let's do some live coding in the browser. Document query selector vulnerable inner HTML equals, so if we would setting that HTML that jQuery is botching up, right? What? Unexpected token identifier. Ah, yes. One should escape strings properly.
Lucas, sorry to interrupt, but could you maybe make it a bit bigger? It's really hard to see. Thanks.
Yeah. So basically the same idea. If we would set the thing with inner HTML, we would see that this inner HTML would not be vulnerable because it actually adds a style tag and puts all the contents in the style tag. So if I'm hovering here, there's nothing to hover, right? Yeah. Yes. That's it as far as the demo. We can go back if something was too quick, or I should show something again, or we should try exploit this view stuff in a different way. Otherwise, I just want to repeat my recommendations. Do not trust user-generated content, right? Whenever a user inputs something, do not trust it, right? With your life, it's not possible. And one of the interesting things is user-generated doesn't necessarily mean that it's generated by humans. It can also mean that you have a dependency somewhere that creates HTML from Markdown. What if somebody updates that dependency to be nefarious? What if you have non-user generated content by consuming an API, right? You're calling an API and you get HTML back and you put just the HTML there. Yes, you generally trust that system, that they give you clean HTML, but what if they don't tomorrow, right? This is generally the problem. Sometimes it's also, hey, this field doesn't contain any HTML, so it's safe to put it there with vHTML for whatever reason. But someone nefarious might be able to put HTML in there. We had the problem in the past with automatically generated reports, for example. So we had a tool that was generating a JSON report. We are trusting the JSON report and rendered the HTML, but we didn't think about the possibility that someone could add something to the JSON report, or and thus created an XSS potential in the past. You should definitely not trust vHTML. Whatever you're using, please use something like DOM Purify. There might even be a better implementation solution. So one of the implementation solutions that you could use, you could write a view render function component, or you could write something like you could, basically lint with ESLint everywhere that nobody is using vHTML. And then you have that one way, that one component that wraps DOM Purify and is the safe one. That being said, again, don't trust the dependencies. I mean, you should trust DOM Purify. It's good, right? But you never know if DOM Purify of today will be the DOM Purify of tomorrow. And because browsers are constantly evolving, there might be new attack vectors. Someone might be able to inject JavaScript with emojis or with some obscure encodings or whatnot. And by trusting DOM Purify, you're already taking a big leap because nobody wants to implement such a library themselves. But you should also make sure that those dependencies are up to date. So don't trust them that they work forever. The web evolves, the JavaScript evolves, everything evolves, Vue evolves. So make sure that Vue and DOM Purify and all these great dependencies are up to date. With other dependencies, if you use Vue libraries, double check if they're using vHTML. I didn't go into it, but if we have time, we could go into it live, just in order to embarrass myself a little bit after the questions. Also check sometimes Vue components are using render functions, so they could be setting inner HTML to something that's not properly cleaned up. Sometimes, if you're consuming the Vue libraries, the Vue libraries themselves are not the Vue libraries you see in GitHub or GitLab or in source code and wherever. Double check, that the libraries that you use match what you see in GitHub or wherever, right? There is this great site called Unpackaged, for example, and so this is our own component library, and you can see what people have compiled, right? This is generally true for every dependency. Really check what's happening there. I mean, it might not be important for dependencies that are part of your build tree, but everything that you put in your app and use is basically your own code because you ship it to your users. So double check them. And the same for Vue. Scanning for vHTML is probably pretty quick, but you should also see that a library, whether it sets inner HTML, right? So if you're still using like old jQuery plugins or whatever, they could all be doing not so good things and potentially be exploitable. So, maybe stay clear of them. That's it. I think the talk was planned for 60 minutes and 30 minutes of questions. But when I gave in my 60 minutes, I actually thought, hey, maybe let's do that the 60 minutes will already include questions. So with 40 minutes of the talk, I think we are at a good point for questions. So if you have any questions, shoot. And yeah, there are no wrong questions. Even like easy seeming questions are okay. Maybe I went too fast at some point. Thank you all for listening. Just, if you have any questions, shoot. Okay, Alex is raising a hand. So do you want to ask a question, Alex?
Yes, indeed.
Cool.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for the talk. Really nice insights. So imagine you have a really small application where you have no user input and you use vHTML, for example, to make it easy to, say, put in some things from vue-ITN that are, well, more complex instead of like using slots and stuff. Would you still use DOM Purify for that? So if you're in control of the full input of vHTML?
So, I mean, that really depends, right? That's actually a good point with translations, because this is also something that we struggled with, especially, I don't know if everyone knows how translations work, but generally how translations work, you have like a string and sometimes you need to replace stuff in that string. And especially with Vue components and so on, it's sometimes easier if you, for example, want to translate, for help, click here. You want to translate in all languages. Part of that message is probably going to be a link. So you might need to inject via HTML. And with vue-ITN or other libraries that do that, you're basically, I think I would, and this is also user-generated content, if you do the translations yourself, right? So if you do, if you trust Vue 1.18n, you should be fine on that front. And if you trust the translations, because if you outsource the translations and you have 5,000 strings to translate, it could be that you have a nefarious German translator, right?
Yeah, true.
So you basically, that's also user-generated content. So, and the cost of DOM Purify is probably not that big. So you could potentially wrap it and, you know, basically also write a Vue HTML save directive. But I would recommend it because it doesn't cost you much, and it probably enforces enforces good code in the team, because people are used to using a safe way of vHTML and don't have to think about twice, right? I think the mental overhead of looking at something and be like, hey, should I do that or should I do this, is way more problematic, especially in larger teams, than just say, hey, we're going to use DOM Purify everywhere. Yeah.
I fully agree on that, especially the point with the mental overhead. So thanks for the answer.
Yeah. Cool. Do you use tools to test your application against XCS? Do you mean tool if we are testing GitLab automatically? Or yes. I think partially. I mean, the whole XSS component that we have is not only, or potential that we have is not necessarily just on the Vue side. We have a Ruby backend, or if you have like a PHP backend, or, you know, use some other backend under the hood, you have the same problem. So even if you're completely safe on the Vue side, we should, there is the potential that the Ruby side still does things, right? So even linting on the Vue side and using DOM Purify and everything might not protect you. You also need to do it if you generate just like 1 byte potentially of HTML from your backend. And I think we're using some automatic scanning. So there are some tools. I don't have them and I'm not responsible for it. So I assume, I think some people in the company are running automated tests, you know, that basically spin up the application and try fuzzying. So they basically try to submit forms with potential XSSs, you know, they put like these alert things everywhere and see if that actually triggers an alert. And if that does it, it means you have an XSS. From the front end perspective, you see we have this save link directive, which was merged fairly recently. And this is also, so we're looking into this more. And this is also why I came up with the idea of that talk, because it's getting more and more in a focus. We still have vHTMLs in the code base, right? Some of them are probably okay because we get clean, most of them are likely okay because we get clean HTML from our backend. But, you know, better be safe than sorry. And yeah, so automated tools would be, I don't know how these calls, probably if you search for XSS generators or something, there are tools that do that automatically to a full started application. We probably do that, short answer. And on the Vue front end, we are, you know, tightening the rules when it comes to vHTML and so on, and basically use automated scanning in order to get rid of it completely. By the way, there is a neat little trick with ESLint. If you have ESLint, someone could use vHTML because, you know, the ESLint Vue plugin. So you have the ESLint Vue plugin, plugin Vue, sorry. And it actually, why is GitHub slow? Maybe I should go to the documentation. User guide, developer guide, available rules, right? And there is like a no vHTML rule. Valid vHTML, so no, that's not the one. And self-closing. You can see there's like a lot of vHTML, no vHTML, right? But this thing doesn't stop someone from putting ESLint ignore at top of the vHTML, and then your ESLint doesn't find it, right? One of the tricks that you can do, you can run ESLint with no inline configuration and just checking for the vHTML rule. So you could, ESLint has the capability that it gets some config, you could have a security config file, and you could run ESLint twice, once with all your normal rules and the ignores are fine, and the second time you run it just with vHTML, with the no vHTML rule enabled, and with the command line parameter that basically it ignores all the inline ignores. I hope this makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, Peter. Or Peter.
So now you're hearing me?
Yeah, yes.
At first I thought, okay, what's the problem with injecting JavaScript on the client? Yeah. If it's on the client, well, then he has some little strange things happening on this machine of the attacker. But of course, later it's about user input. It's about what's being saved at some server or so.
Yeah.
So of course, the first thing, always check at the server.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what you get from the front end. Never trust this at all.
Yeah.
That's the point. And I saw Vue-Don't Purify HTML also exists at NPM. It's a directive where you could exchange vHTML with Don't Purify HTML, and it works kind of the same, but this is nice. But in general, I think you're a bit hard on vHTML. At the company I work for, we are working with Laravel, and also with bigger dependency or the shopping system, where at least at the admin backend, there's a lot of injecting bigger parts of PHP generated content in the Vue apps. So there's a lot of Vue and a lot of PHP generated things, because they need to render both also. And so there's also a lot of vHTML going on in there. But I think at least if you have in mind that it's for you, that it's not user input, then why not? Huh?
Yeah, I mean that it really depends. I think the use case that you're saying is fine in some cases. It's basically like the old methodology. For example, if you have and on the Ruby side in Rails, there was this methodology that instead of reloading all of the page back in the day called turbo links, you put something called turbo links in there. And so, for example, if you have a list of things and you paginate, the Rails backend would send you the HTML for the second page, and with the help of jQuery.html, it would have been replaced. And I mean, this is kind of a similar methodology what you're describing. Yeah, I think it's probably fine. The reason why I'm so hard in these talks is like, I really wanted to sink in with people that in order to think about it, right? If I'm using vHTML, is it valid here? And as you're describing, probably in an admin backend, it's not as bad, especially if all the other stuff is controlled by Laravel. But imagine the situation like where potentially you install some plugin in Laravel. And this plugin in Laravel or in this Shopify system or wherever is nefarious and you don't know. I mean, we had it in the past that NPM packages were nefarious. Who doesn't say that dependency or an update of a dependency becomes bad? So if the vHTML is then used and somebody is injecting client-side JavaScript and sends off your admin credentials of your Shopify system over to some Russian hacking server and they are able to log in, and do nefarious stuff with your Shopify system, then it would potentially be bad as well, right? And sometimes you have these things, so better safe than sorry. If you would have used DOM Purify, that stuff could have been removed, even, even if you get like the bad stuff. If you are in control of everything and you're writing your backend, and if you're writing your front end and they're interconnected, and you sometimes send HTML down, I think it's probably completely fine to render it. This is maybe the strict requirement with vHTML is maybe a recommendation more for these new single page applications, right? That pop up everywhere. And also in larger teams, I could see the situation where it's like, hey, we are cross-site scriptable. I thought backend sends us clean HTML. What? I thought front end is sanitizing the HTML, so we probably should touch our own nose and try to write the secure code where we are writing the code, right? And as you're mentioning, this tool, for example, looks really cool. This is probably what I've recommended. Hey, you can just use it. I haven't checked out the source code, so please take the recommendation with from my side at least double check the code what it's actually doing. But it doesn't cost anything to replace the vHTML with the vDOM Purify HTML.
Yeah. It depends. If it's really bigger stuff, like in my example, then there is other JavaScript files or things that are injected in there, and that's absolutely fine, kind of fine. It's ugly. You doesn't want to have that, but if it's already there, then it's hard to say no.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Ah, cool. Yeah. So it even has different ideas for SVG and so on. Yeah. That's Again, we're always describing ideal scenarios with this stuff. Yeah. Cool. Patrick raised a hand, or Patrick. Yeah.
Thanks a lot also for me for the talk. It was really cool. Well, thanks a lot for you. So what you just talked about, I found super interesting when we talk about ideal worlds. So when we think about the part where you said, okay, check your dependencies. So especially in the JavaScript world, we love dependencies. Our dependencies have dependencies, and they have dependencies because they need dependencies. And so it's not uncommon for projects to have, maybe I have 50 dependencies, they have 5 other at each.
Yeah. And
there will be a lot. Like there will be a lot of things, there will be a lot to review. And theoretically, I would need to review all the dependencies line by line to make sure nothing malicious is happening everywhere, which sounds to me quite unrealistic in a, like let's say on a work day to review them all. And whenever I update one, I need to check them all again when they get updated again. So there will be some automated solutions, I guess, you use for that, and that would be interesting for me to know about, because this is I think still quite probably one of the biggest probabilities where something can go wrong. If someone puts a package on npm, for example, that is malicious, somehow gets it done. I mean, this happened before, and as soon as you have that, it's hard to detect and to make sure. And I think it's super hard to make sure it's not there. So that would be interesting. If you could talk a bit about it.
We can talk a bit about that. So, you mentioned dependencies and of dependencies. So these are the dependencies of GitLab.
Yes.
That's
exactly, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
There will be a few.
Yes, there will be a few. So there are two things. One of the things is dependencies might be outdated. Like, for example, jQuery, they have a security vulnerability. Just because a dependency has a potential security vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean that you're vulnerable, right? So if Bootstrap modules have a vulnerability and you don't use it, you're not affected by it. So you always need to talk about a vulnerability finding or something that's potential, or you need to talk about the actual vulnerability that you have. So, and I think there are multiple layers that we need to unfold. So this is the first one. And the cool thing is you don't get automated updates anymore, right? So the So with our log files that we have, yarn log or package JSON log, it's not like in the past that someone pushes a new version of a dependency and suddenly it's vulnerable and you have a problem. You know, it has right now updating dependencies is a decision. I agree, especially with existing projects, it's probably not feasible to go in and look at every one of those dependencies. But, and here comes the but that I would recommend. There is a tool. There are certain tools. One that we use is Renovate Bot. And Renovate Bot creates merge requests for dependency updates, right? And so let's say just in order, you could create a list of all the dependencies that you have and say, hey, let's go checking why we use this dependency. I think that makes sense for multiple reasons. One being security, the other just like, hey, why do we have 5 different charting libraries, right? Maybe it's you know, why do we have chart.js? Why do we have this? Why do we have that? Maybe it makes sense to move to one that, you know, is smaller, more performant, newer, or let's move all to D3. And the other one, let me just find it real quick. Where is the, am I blind? Yeah, the big screen. So we have this dependency updating that happens automatically. It's called, no, this is the wrong one. Ooh, let me find it. Yes. So this is a good example. Let me check. Yeah. So you have like this dependency bot, and there are probably more than one, you know, that send you a merge request every time there's a dependency update. And the cool thing is they include a change link. So if you click that change link, they actually compare the resulting JavaScript of the 2 versions, and rather than reviewing the 3 lines of changes that you made here, isn't it feasible to look into this div and see, hey, okay, this is our icon library. Okay, it seems like one person has added 1 new icon. Or similarly, if someone updates another dependency, you know, it would be feasible. If the tool updates another dependency, it would be feasible to see, hey, okay, jQuery updated. What actually happened under the hood of jQuery, right? Yeah, and I mean, nobody forces you to do updates. I think there should be a balance, but it would, you know, this allows a maintainer or reviewer of your code base to double check what actually happened between those 2 versions, right? Yeah. But I agree. And I mean, this is probably the way to go, would be like accept the status quo and maybe check which dependencies are out of date and activate automated updating. We do it mainly for our internal dependencies, but want to extend it in the future so that we, for example, update Vue when there's a new update out. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. That's a really cool tool.
Yeah.
I will look into this one.
Yeah, I can share the link. Not affiliated, just using it.
You should affiliate them.
I think they're affiliated with another company. Yeah. So, but there are other tools out there. So just search for it for updates. And when it comes to security scanning, there are also tools out there, especially GitLab also has tools that, for example, scan your code base and say, hey, you're using that outdated version of jQuery. I can show you right now because it might leak, you know, that we use something, right? But I don't have a good example, but there are also other tools out there that, you know, scan your code. There's even Yarn has it itself, right? So if you do Yarn audit, hopefully this is like, has some, yes. You can see because I used the old version of jQuery and it actually tells you, hey, moderate chance of cross-site scripting. So in your project, if you run Yarn audit, you're able to see and then click here and try to understand what is actually the thing that happens in jQuery. So Yarn audit is also your friend.
Cool. Yes, GitHub is also doing that when you have something that will send you a weekly report telling you, hey, these are the vulnerabilities we detected. So if you're still using this project, please check them.
Yeah.
And it's really cool. But what you said before, I find interesting because whenever, no matter what we use, we still rely on some third party to check our dependencies. So instead of saying, hey, we trust the dependencies, we say we trust the tool that checks our dependencies. So is this not another dependency? So do we check the tool then? Or because if I say Yarn audit, I trust Yarn, but I didn't write Yarn. So theoretically, I would need to check Yarn. You know what I mean? This is like a never-ending circle somehow. And for me, it all still boils down to you need to review every line of code that's somehow in your project, because at some point you need to trust some tool.
Yeah, the crazy thing is Facebook itself, for example, they're checking in their node modules, right? And then then you don't need this tool to tell you the diff, but if you update a dependency, you have the diff right in your merge request, right?
Yes.
And I mean, there are certain benefits for that. Last year I was at a talk from one of the Webpack people, and he said always consume the source. But because this is also a question, it's not necessarily about security, but also sometimes dependency are not, compiled or bundled in the optimal way. And at some point you need to trust certain people or authorities. So for example, NPM itself is an authority. They have these advisories. And there are certain entities in the world that are called advisory entities. So you see Apollo Server Lambda, right, where they upload, like if there's a dependency. So for example, the problem with the dependency, you see, for example, hey, jQuery, right? Yeah. And there are ways like this is basically what GitHub is using under the hood and so on, right? Yeah, but it really shows to the state how we sometimes deal with dependencies. I assume it differs from company to company, but sometimes, I made the joke in the past that like, hey, if I have a tricky merge request review, it would be easier for me to create an NPM package and import this NPM package and never have anyone from my company review that, right? Yeah. Because, it adds a new dependency that does the thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So some other person maybe has some great idea that solves this problem completely. I'm still looking for a solution for myself. So
yeah,
if someone has a solution already to all these problems, that would be cool. Please share them now. I would be really grateful. Yeah, this is kind of a never-ending thing. I mean, I don't think there is this perfect, okay, do this and then it makes sense from time spent point of view and everything will be 100% secure point of view. I don't think that's possible.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so as well. It's just like sometimes, think about the problems and, take the pragmatic approach. And I mean, one of the things that, where it was asked about automatic security scanning, GitLab is also taking the pragmatic approach by offering, bounties if people find such vulnerabilities. Because that gets people to testing the code, and it's and it's just a business decision. Okay, we pay out some money if someone finds that dependency, and like Peter already mentioned before, is like if it's just like an internal admin project that lives in your internal network, or is like the back end of your tool or whatever, who cares, right? Or if it's like some part of non-critical infrastructure, who cares, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but in our case, if GitLab is vulnerable, it's pretty horrific because there are public instances from people out there, like other people have GitLabs, and if people are able to exploit that, right, and get credentials or to servers or these kind of things, would be bad. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Cool. Any more questions, clarifications? I'm in a very talkative mode and I haven't even opened my beer yet. Yeah.
So there was one more question in chat, I think. Is it possible to override the core directive via HTML?
That's a really good question. One of the ideas, and I don't know, is Ben still here? Yes, I don't know if Ben can speak. But one of the questions that I had myself is like, why isn't, vHTML using something like DOM Purify under the hood, at least in other dependencies like Bootstrap, for example, or jQuery, they have some purification going on internally anyway, right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what actually happens if you use vue use and would name it like the internal directive. Would it use the internal one or this one? It would be a really good question. Let's try it out. How does one write a directive? I've never written a directive before. No, maybe let's not try it out. Yeah, maybe that would be a potential thing to override it. Yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't know if there's like an issue or RFC, view RFC, to make vHTML safe by default.
I'm not sure if this is possible, but even if it is, I would highly recommend not to override a view core directive, because if someone else is using your project or working on that project, it should not be the case that view HTML does something else. It's something, I don't know. You can always write your own directive and then use that one.
Yeah. And then basically with linting, right? With ESLint, for example, you would be on the safe side, right? That nobody else uses vHTML. And then you're okay for your project. I don't know. Is there like, maybe there was an RFC. Maybe we should open one.
And also answered, by the way, in the chat.
Yes, please. So about opening one. I wasn't around for the original design of the API, but my guess is that it was not to force people down a path. Yeah, I assume it's the same thing. I mean, React has the same thing with dangerously whatever, right? Maybe if we open the thing, it's in time for Vue 3, or in Vue 4, we will also call vHTML v's dangerously set HTML, right? But in any case, please spread the news about that vHTML is dangerous potentially, and get people to purify it. Yeah, definitely do so. I think there's a lot of value in having this discussion.
I just thought about Vue taking vHTML, DOM purify or something like this in general for vHTML, and then give people another vHTML dangerously blah directive to not do that. But then this would be something cool for in the beginning, but now this would be a breaking change, and just for having that, I think this wouldn't be nice.
I mean, the thing is, you can always, and maybe I'm now whipping out the code editor, the under the hood implementation of vHTML is actually not that hard. vHTML, or if you have like a component, you have that possibility to view render function, right? JS actually we could do, but let's go with view. Where it's like script, and because these single file components get compiled to a render function anyway, so you could always do the dangerous thing, right? Export default and render. Is it render? Yeah, I think so, right? Render. Now create element. So actually, if you look at view render function data attributes, yeah, I think this is probably the search that I wanted. No need to. So basically, what the directive does is setting inner HTML. Oh, wait, maybe we can make it easier and show it here, like vHTML. Div vHTML equals foo. Yes. So this is actually what this does, right? So let's copy it here, and yeah. So create element in order to show it, right? So div vHTML equals foo. Okay. Foo, and if we make that a string, that would be the same, right? So this below is the same as the above. So with the render function API, you have the possibility to set inner HTML yourself generally, right? So this is basically equivalent. So the thing that the directive does is setting inner HTML of an element to foo. Yeah, this is the internal implementation. So you could go about creating a directive which does this in a safe way, right? And yeah, or create a component that does this in a safe way, like the thing. And I feel now like I'm repeating myself. Yep. Hello, old friend. Cool. I'm giving 5 more seconds for questions related to this. If not, I'm going to stop the recording. And you can ask all the questions that you want to ask, or we can discuss stuff, or go home, or drink our beer.